AI can become us in a much more compelling way than we are ourselves. And suddenly we lose control not only of our finances, but of our reputation, our credibility, our network, our friendships, everything. I am not trying to scare people within the concept of Skynet, because it's much more practical than Skynet and like robots launching nukes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very present reality. All of our internet infrastructure and systems are built in a way to fend off bad actors that are human. And we're very good at catching that now, but there's an entire race of potential bad actors that, by the way, have no ethics. They don't see it as a morality issue. Agents do not see it. They see it as an efficiency and productivity issue. They're trying to accomplish a goal. They'll do whatever is necessary to accomplish the goal. That is their mission, right?
Hello and welcome back to another exclusive Boom Room interview. It's your friends at Arcanum Ventures, Sasha and Carmelo, and today we have an incredible guest joining us. His name is Gary Liu. He is co-founder and CEO of Terminal 3, a technology infrastructure company ushering in the age of digital identities. Gary, it's a pleasure to see you again. It's been a little while since we've spoke. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's great to have you, man. We want to dive into everything around Terminal 3, the vision, the core mission, how it's being received. But we know that you have a very impressive background, and very notably, one of the CEOs and founders of Digg. For some of our viewers that are maybe old enough, or they kind of
got to be quite old.
They kind of grew up in the age of the frontier of internet media. Digg was referred to as the homepage of the internet, and it was up there with Reddit. I believe that it was like these two colossal platforms that were muscling for space. And then later you moved into a CEO position at the South China Morning Post, an absolute institution. So before we dive into all of that, I wanted to ask, who is Gary Liu? Give us an idea of how you got started in the early days of media on the internet and how you came to be here today, co-founding and leading Terminal 3.
Well, the short answer to that question, Sasha, is that it's all by accident. I think that if we go back and retell the story, you can always find a thread that makes me sound much more prescient than I ever actually was. It was by accident. I fell into technology because I was in a part of the United States, Ann Arbor, Michigan in particular, that frankly was struggling at that moment in time economically, and there were not a lot of jobs available right after I graduated from university. And one of the few companies that was hiring in Ann Arbor was Google. And the only qualification that they needed at that time, because it's just started a sales office, they were looking for a bunch of back-end operations folks. And they just needed somebody who knew how to use Excel. And I happen to have learned, and this is how old I am, by the way, that Excel was a special skill at that point on a resume, whereas now it's just, you grow up using it in school. For me, I had learned to use Excel because I'm a huge baseball fan, and because of fantasy baseball, I learned how to use Excel, and that's how I fell into technology. So I worked at Google. Then I had the privilege of working for a couple of other very large technology companies, including Spotify, when Spotify was still very young. I was one of the first 20 employees of Spotify in the United States. This was shortly after Spotify had just received its American licenses in 2011. So still very early on, it was a completely unknown technology company, unknown brand. We were breaking into an industry that was dominated at that point by Pandora. And then YouTube was also fast growing as a music streaming service, and got to participate in that rocket ship ride for about 3.5 years. And then ended up at Digg. I was not one of the founders. I took over Digg in its second iteration. Kevin Rose founded the company in 2005. And as you mentioned, Sasha, it grew up with Reddit. And for many years, Digg was the industry leader. Digg invented upvoting as a way to organize information and content. Digg really was the homepage of the internet. I think that was its official tagline for quite some time. But it functioned as that for those of us who are old enough to remember those moments of Web 1.0. And then when I took over as CEO of Digg, it was for reinvention. Reddit had won for a bunch of reasons we don't have to get into, and the Digg was rebuilding as a pipe of curated information for both casual internet consumers, but also for enterprise use cases. So we actually productized a lot of the the algorithmic clustering of data and content for commercial purposes. And then I landed in Hong Kong. Again, I'm not telling you an identity story. I'm telling you a very clear sequential story because I don't want to pretend like if I had this vision in mind when I was younger. But I landed in Hong Kong in 2016 at a very important moment to the world, at a very, very important news organization and in a job that I was so incredibly underqualified for that it's actually comical that I ended up in that job. The news organization with the South China Morning Post. It is a 120-plus-year-old news company, always headquartered in Hong Kong, has been for well over a century the newspaper of record for Hong Kong, which frankly means to the rest of the world it is the newspaper of record effectively for China. For its entire history, the role of the South China Morning Post is to understand what's happening in China, a closed information system, and tell that story as objectively, as freely as possible to the rest of the world. And during the 6 years that I was CEO, 2016 all the way through to 2022, a few things happened to the world and a few things happened to China. We had the first US-China trade war that we can remember in our lifetimes because of the ascension of Trump, or his first ascension. We then had the protests in Hong Kong. We then had COVID. And then Hong Kong's changing political reality, the changing reality of Southeast Asia, all of this in a very, very short period of time where news was of great importance to the world. So that's where I discovered blockchain technologies. And it was for enterprise use cases. I've never been in crypto. I've never been cool enough to do what most of the guests on this podcast do, which is speculate in this global, kind of casino, but also at the same time be able to build fundamentally new things with now digital money and digital stakeholdership. That was not my entry into blockchain technology. My entry into blockchain technology was very boring. It was immutable records of things that humanity needs to remember. It was enterprise database efficiency and productivity. And then it became data privacy and security. And I became convinced that this technology should change the world for the better in protecting our identity and our data sovereignty. And that's how Terminal 3 was born about 4 years ago. So I didn't answer your question, but hopefully I gave enough that other people can figure out who I am.
You answered it so well, and this is Mello and I want to dive into all of these topics that you brought up, these different experiences, but we want to kind of through line them to Terminal 3 and going back to your experience through Spotify and Digg, the early days of the internet. Still, even though you had come into Digg a little bit later, the internet was a very exciting place when Digg and Reddit were at their peaks, right? And many people might think of those early days being a little bit like more unfiltered internet experience, and that's where the kind of upvoting came. These algorithms they're not what they are today, and they resemble a little bit more of like a meritocracy back then. I think we've come a long way in terms of what social media and algorithms are. And so I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, like, what do you think are some of the most important things that we've lost since that time compared to what we see nowadays with social media usage and the algorithms that drive them?
That's such a great question. I think the key thing we've lost is the positive idea of gatekeepers. I think gatekeeping now is seen as a very negative. There's a very negative connotation, right, to the term. It's either one of two things: either you're keeping secrets that the world should know to yourself, right, like gatekeeping the best new, matcha shop in Brooklyn, right, or it's gatekeeping as in I think I'm the only source of truth, and so I'm, the rest of the world needs to listen to me, and we live in a world that just does not like that concept. But here's the truth. I should say, here's more the reality. The reality is that that there is truth. There are truths that are objective, right? That is not about perspective. It is black. It is white. And in the world of news, actually, the entire industry of news and the entire profession of journalism is to uncover from noise what the clearest version of truth could be. Now, journalists and great news organizations do not always get it right, but they certainly always aspire to get it right. And their ability to do so has actually been trained over many, many years of not only education, but on the ground experience. And at the end of the day, what it is, it's pattern recognition that allows people to distill noise into truth. And that is why I do think that gatekeepers of truth are so important. These are people who've dedicated their entire lives to academic study and to professional work that should give them the right to say, between multiple different perspectives, this is the one that is closest to objective truth. And we've lost that, right? With Digg in the early versions of Web 1, what Digg was doing was using the concept of the upvote, the voice of a collective peoples, to try and distill what the authority about an issue ought to be. The expectation was that if you have a large enough cross-section of society voting in an informed way about a group of or cluster of articles, then the best or the highest quality ones would rise to the top. And generally speaking, that was true. What has changed from that day to now with social media is that our feeds are no longer universal. Our feeds are custom. They're just for Mello, just for Sasha, just for Gary. Okay? And so because of that, we are now playing an algorithmic game where we want to capture long-term attention. The platforms do. And because of that, it's much, much easier to fill your feed with things not of quality, but of acceptance and of singular belief. Because then it's much more likely that you stay on the feed, right? Human beings do not like being confronted with opinions that are different from their own, or reality that is different from their own. So gatekeeping is not a skill set we treasure anymore. And therefore, the quality or even the understanding of truth has, I think, deteriorated. That I bemoan a little bit.
I think most people would agree with you that the quality of the algorithm and the quality of social media has declined in the last several years, especially because, like you rightly said, the world has been going a little bit crazier than usual. But is there anything positive to say about the algorithms or the current state of social media right now? Is there anything that it does well or has improved on?
Of course there is. So one thing, of course, is distribution, right? Not all content is bad. And there is just still is a lot of really, really high quality content that is rooted in truth. And the megaphone or the bullhorn for it today is much louder and much bigger than it used to be. Which means, generally speaking, important information can get to a larger swath of global population today than it did in the past. You take a look at what's going on around the world, our understanding, our global understanding of regional international conflicts. Okay, what is happening in the Middle East? What happened with Syria over the course of the last several years? Even in the early days of Web 2, what happened in Northern Africa and Egypt and the Spring Awakening there. All of these things happen in a world where information distribution was much more democratized. Because of, again, the shift away from gatekeepers, the pipes became wider, they became more varied, and important information could get to a much larger quantum of human beings. I think that has made a world a better place because at the very least there is greater understanding. Now, of course, with that, there are moments of political strife that, again, driven by capitalism and driven by just the economics of the internet, have meant that these large pipes are purposefully segmented so that you just get the information that you already agree with. That's where we run into trouble. But yeah, we definitely live in a world where information distribution is more democratic, and that I think is a good thing for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of step through from this period in your experience, a lot of the lessons that you had taken and the perspective that you gained around the developing landscape of media and social media on the internet, and how that sort of translated into you stepping into your role as CEO at the South China Morning Post. And hilariously, you said you stepped in this role that you were completely unqualified for, which hopefully gives people inspiration that there are like incredible opportunities everywhere just awaiting them. But I'm curious from your perspective, like this is a big pivot going from internet entrepreneur to literal, ink and paper, legacy print media. And so what kind of drew you into this, and what gave you interest in stepping into this completely new industry where, there must have been some insight into, the political tensions that were unfolding in Hong Kong at the time and what was to come, but also just a completely different organization and infrastructure?
Another great question. It was a long path to both sides agreeing to work together, because both sides knew that they were taking a massive risk. I mean, frankly speaking, the risk on the company side was much larger. They were taking a risk on somebody who was not proven in the news industry whatsoever, was from the other side of the world, and moving into a position for foundational transformation, right? And everything, I mean, honestly, the cards were stacked against us. Everything could have and probably should have gone wrong. And by a stroke of both luck and the effort of my colleagues, it turned out the exact opposite. It was one of the great transformation and success stories in traditional news media over the course of the last 2 decades. When I first stepped into the discussion, I certainly didn't think that I was going to be a final candidate. And I did not think that even if I was offered the job, I would say yes. It was out of curiosity, because this very old and very famous news organization had just been taken over by Alibaba. Okay, this gigantic Chinese internet conglomerate, which by the time they bought the South China Morning Post, which was in the early 2016, they had finally become a global household name. They went public probably just a few years before that. And prior to that, I mean, they were very well known in China. They were growing in reputation across Asia. I think in the Americas, it really wasn't until their IPO that people started to pay attention to be like, oh my goodness, look at this Amazon of China, which is a terrible analogy for Alibaba, but look at this Amazon of China and look what they've been able to accomplish. And to have this company go and buy a news or traditional news organization in Hong Kong, the question was why? Okay. There could have been a lot of insidious reasons to do so. And I was amongst the group that was wondering, oh, maybe they're looking, to turn it into a propaganda machine for China or whatnot. And then there are also very practical reasons of influence for a news organization for a large internet company to do this. And when I got into the conversations and finally met with the two most famous co-founders of Alibaba, Jack Ma and Joe Tsai, the story I heard was completely different than what I expected. And I genuinely mean this. I am not, recounting stories with rose-tinted glasses. Genuinely, what I heard was two people, and in particular Joe Tsai, who believed in the sanctity of objective and independent news, who had been a Hong Kong resident at that point for 20-some years and had effectively grown up reading the South China Morning Post, believed that in this moment in time, global understanding of China was more important than ever before, and saw the South China Morning Post as an institution that demanded investment and deserved protection. That was their mission. Okay? You can believe it or you don't need to believe it. I believed it. And over my 6 years working for Joe, he was chairman, I was CEO. He never wavered from that commitment. So that's what I stepped into. And once I had that commitment, and Joe and I jammed for like 3 hours in Southern California one day about what the South China Morning Post could be, what elevating the Asian voice could look like for two people who are of Asian descent, but actually were educated. Both of us were educated in the West, and then he went back to Asia as in his late 20s to work. And we're raising our kids in Asia. All of these things, it really started to matter to me at a personal level. So the political concerns, frankly, the honest difficulty of turning around an oil tanker, right? The internal struggles that I kind of academically knew I would inevitably be greeted with when I joined the company. Those things all became background because I had a commitment from an owner for change that I believe was better for the world. And then I had a personal mission now that I feel like I had to fulfill. That's the reason why I took the job.
Wow, that's incredible. I have a large hunch that your time there informed the decision to build Terminal 3, but I wanted to ask, what were the biggest challenges of running that massive journalist institution? And, like we said, that it's been really crazy the last 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, but what were the biggest challenges that you had to face, and how did that kind of inform the decision to start a company yourself?
Melo, you have 3 hours to go through this?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
There are so many. Let me try to boil them down. Let me just tell you
top 3 or 4, maybe.
I'll give you top two challenges. The first challenge was that, like most traditional newspapers, SCMP, when I joined, no longer knew who their actual core audience was or how to actually reach them. Because newspaper audience had changed, media audiences had changed because of the distribution channels. What they expected of a news media company had quite dramatically changed. And when you were a news organization like the South China Morning Post, and you've been doing the same thing successfully for so long, and by the way, I really mean successfully, because the South China Morning Post, during a period of time in the 1990s and early 2000s, was the world's most profitable newspaper per page. And it was printing money. It was not only printing newspapers, it was like effectively printing money. So when you've been that successful for that long and that important, it's really hard to reshape yourself. And I think actually that is probably one of the reasons why the new owners decided to bring somebody completely from a different industry that was so underqualified, because frankly speaking, there were no golden cows for me in the business. There was nothing sacred in that business besides, without fear and favor, objective truth, right? Everything else could be, we could litigate, and we could change if we needed to. But changing how journalists think about their audience is really, really difficult. Okay, they have in their mind what their one reader is, but in the digital world, we don't have a single ICP. We have dozens of categories of readers, all wanting completely different things. How do you, with limited resources, in one article at a time, serve all of those audiences? Figuring that out was really, really difficult. And then the second thing is changing the concept of what product is for a news organization. And this is where the vast majority of traditional news organizations that have gone through transformation have failed. Because, again, for decades, if not like over a century, these news organizations had a singular product. It was the daily broadsheet. It was A1 through C24 or whatever, however thick your newspaper is. That was your product. And every single person got the exact same product, and there was a natural flow to the product. And therefore, when you assembled the newspaper, if you wanted to tell a story through an arc, you knew I put the story on the marquee in the front page. At the end of that story, if any of your audience remembers what a newspaper is, there is a continued on page X, and you flip to that page, you finish the story, and then right underneath that story, there is probably a second story about the exact same topic, but from a slightly different perspective. So by the end of reading a package of stories, a reader has a relatively comprehensive point of view. You cannot do that in the digital world, right? So the concept of product has fundamentally changed. And beyond that, it's gone from words to video to Instagram posts to podcasts, right? To now, 7-second TikToks. So the format of storytelling also fundamentally changed. So we had to completely reconstitute what product was for the news organization. So I think those two things, and again, Melo, I'm not even touching on the Black Swan stuff, right? I'm not touching on the protests. I'm not touching on COVID. I'm not touching on the national security law, but just in the internal operations of the news organization, those were two of the great struggles that we had to endure.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear more about those Black Swan events, but I'm not sure how much you're actually allowed to talk about it, or but you kind of did mention it, like with journalistic integrity and objectivity, and that kind of leads us to our next question. And you rightly said that they brought you in for a fresh perspective. You're working in tech. You don't come from a journalism background, so now we're starting to see media companies and journalistic institutions, old ones, being run more like tech companies, and tech companies and social media companies being run more like journalistic institutions. So right now we meet a lot of people that get their news exclusively from Twitter or Instagram, like you said. And it kind of harkens back to your time at Digg as well, like being the front page for the internet. But yeah, what do you think about this? One of the problems I've observed is people just reporting the news. Objectivity be damned. I want to be first. I want to be the first person to break the news, even if it's 50% true or 0% true. It doesn't matter to me because I want those clicks. I want that attention. And a lot of people have made a career over that, just breaking stories that don't exist. And now they become these trusted gatekeepers, even though they've proven to be unreliable and maybe outright propaganda mouthpieces are lying about something. So do you see this as like a major problem today or at your time as CEO at the Journal?
Yeah, it definitely is a problem. And again, it still at the end of the day comes back to internet economics. Folks that are breaking news for the sake of being first, not because they're right or even because they understand, they're rewarded for it, right? And that's what's broken. It's internet economics. When we've given away everything for free for 30 years, and the only way to pay for it is advertising, it means that attention is the currency. And we do know that the best way of driving attention is not, it's rarely actually the right way, right? It is rarely the right thing to do. Bad things, sometimes wrong things, definitely skewed and opinionated things drive a lot more attention than basic, boring, down the road, objective truth. Okay. So the start of this fix needs to include internet economics, but it's not just that, right? Media literacy has gone down the drain because we no longer teach it in schools. When I was growing up, media literacy was part of civics. And civics doesn't exist in American education anymore. It's crazy to me that it is not taught anymore in schools. So that is part of the problem that we need to fix. We have a political system now that also no longer cares about truth. They care about volume. And again, going back to internet economics, it's also driven by that because those same distribution channels for news, Melo, that you mentioned, is the same distribution channels for influence for politicians in most Western liberal democracies. So if our leaders don't care about truth, then the entire support infrastructure of informed decision-making from democracy all the way down, right, is not going to care as much about truth either. So there are many fundamental problems that do need to be fixed. By the time I got to the Post in 2016, those problems were well established. They have become increasingly more acute in the last 10 years since I took over at SCMP. And honestly, AI agents and the rise of Gen AI has only made things worse at an extraordinary acceleration. Okay. So we have not; these things have not gotten better. They have unfortunately gotten worse. But thankfully, we do now have new technologies that could form the foundation of a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry for harping on this because I'm fascinated by this, especially like I believe in journalistic integrity as well. And it is a big deal to me, but I know it's not the most profitable thing. But now we're
Yeah.
sort of starting to see these tech companies or billionaires, especially in the US, with the acquisition of TikTok in the US and also, CNN, I believe in Paramount. But a lot of these companies are just doing this to have their own mouthpiece. Basically, they're not doing it for journalistic integrity. They're not doing it because they see it as a huge money printer like it once was. But how do you stay profitable now uh, as a journalist entity in 2026? Because like a lot of what I see, even I go on websites like Digg or Reddit, and you see headlines, and a lot of them are misleading. A lot of them are clickbaity. Some even AI generated. So like, how do you play the game honestly and still make money and still have that integrity? Because it seems like they've abandoned that completely just in the pursuit of making as much money and capturing that attention.
Yeah, you brought up a bunch of points there, Melo. Let me try to address a few of them one by one. The first thing I'll say is this: I think it's really, really easy to look at billionaires buying news organizations and assume that they're going to do bad. Um, and listen, there are enough examples of them doing bad that it has shaped our immediate default reaction to it, right? Um, but I hope that we, as intelligent media consumers, will one start by giving them the benefit of the doubt, and then two, if it turns out that they are malicious, then we vote with our attention, right? We literally vote with our time and eyeballs. Take Jeff Bezos and Washington Post as an example. I know that over the course of the last year, in particular, the Washington Post has come under massive fire. A bunch of extremely tenured journalists have quit in protest. And it seems somewhat clear that Bezos has kind of changed the way that he interacts with that news organization. And certainly the leadership that he has put in makes us wonder about the continued objectivity of that company. But let me remind you that for well over a decade before all of this happened and before Trump 2.0, Jeff Bezos was a phenomenal owner of the Washington Post. He bought that news organization in 2013. And over the course of the last 10 the first 10 years, 2013 to 2023, he probably poured more money into that news organization than any newspaper in the world has ever burned in a 10-year period. And because of that, the Washington Post rediscovered its strengths, its identity, and became extremely important not only to American democracy, but for people all around the world understanding what was going on in Washington, D.C. during really, really important years, right? Of fracture and, and reconstitution and all these things. So there was a period of time where Bezos did exactly what he promised. What changed his mind, or whether or not he actually changed his mind, we will not know. We're not in the room. But I do know that news is a really, really hard business. So it's very possible that you have billionaire owners. I'm not ascribing this, by the way, to Bezos, but I can totally understand. If they're very rich owners sitting in a room going, we need this organization to survive for the next generation. And the way to do it right now is to make money. And here is a way to make money. It's easy to judge those decisions, but in the room, those decisions are very difficult to make, and sometimes they feel absolutely necessary. So that's the first thing I would say. I would say this. I'd say that making money off of news right now depends on what you mean by news. News organizations like a New York Times or a CNN, they are a lot of technologists will look at those companies and they'll say, so bloated, right? You have a single article that now they claim AI can write. But you have a single article that goes through a process where 5 or 6 different people touch it before it's ever published online. And a lot of tech entrepreneurs will tell you that is why news organizations are failing. If you actually had a good operator come in and change a news organization, they could cut 60% of the staff, and then the news organization would produce just as much and be much leaner, and they'll be profitable. That's what they would tell you, right? That is exactly what I thought too before I became the CEO of a news company. The reality is that you don't understand how news is made. High quality news is made. Because the reason why 4, 5, 6 people touch that article is because, again, to distill all of the noise of the world into objective truth takes that many people. It takes a journalist to get the facts on the ground and come back and write the first edit. It then takes somebody editor to review it who has had 20 years of pattern recognition to understand how to read between the lines, but also what is probably not true, what is true, and what needs to be followed up on as evidence. It then takes a copy editor whose entire career expertise is on telling a story in a succinct number of words to the maximum impact to rewrite the story so that you and I can actually gain something out of 2 minutes that we're spending with this article. And then eventually, for a traditional newspaper, it takes a layout editor to actually put it in the right place with the right picture to send the right message. Online, it takes an online editor to make sure that it is assembled and packaged properly and distributed properly. So it does take that many people to get the news right. Okay? When you code down to a single human being, that's when mistakes happen. And it doesn't matter if you have the world's best, reporter, right? Famous New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman can still be reporting on DC, but as a single person, their news over the course of a long period of time is going to be less accurate and less trustworthy than if she remains at the New York Times and continues to write the New York Times, because there is a structure that has been created around her that allows her to be that good, right? Now, so that's one thing to understand about the actual economics of news. But then to your actual question, what kind of news is profitable? Ironically, it is that single person newsletter, right?
Yeah.
That becomes really profitable. Newsletters, generally speaking, even if you have a staff of 3 people, you're paying $1 million a year. Sorry, you're making $1 million a year, and your outflow in costs maybe $250,000, right? And everything else is profit for that one byline that writes a newsletter. That's why the newsletter business and new age organizations like the Axioses or the Semaphores of the world are doing so well with just newsletters and events as their 2 primary revenue streams. Can that replace traditional newspapers? I don't think so. So we still have to find a way, and maybe it is public. It's we see it as a public utility again, and we fund it as public service. Or maybe we have benign dictators and benign billionaires buy more and more of these news. I don't know. I mean, the answer is really complicated.
Man, we're coming back full circle. I mean, hopefully our audience and our listeners have a strong understanding now about a lot of these very complex problems within media and news. And I want to take that right back to the beginning where we talked about Terminal 3 and the mission and the vision. And I'm hoping there is some Batman Genesis story here, but I don't know if we're going to get that. I'm just curious, what in your experience at the South China Morning Post pushed you in towards this arena of digital identification and online verification? Give our viewers an idea of where did that drive come from, and what are you doing to pursue that drive with Terminal 3 and the infrastructure that you're building and the business that you're onboarding, the partnerships that you're creating?
Oh, you're muted.
Let me tell you first what Terminal 3 is, and then I'll tell you the Genesis story. It is not as exciting and thankfully not as morbid as Batman's Genesis story. No pearl necklace or back alley murders involved. Terminal 3 is a deep tech company. It's infrastructure. Half of your listeners already tuned out, okay? But what we do on the infrastructure side is really interesting. We are trying to change one fundamental problem with data that has created all of the data privacy and security issues we see in the world, which, by the way, in 2026 is likely to add up to nearly 10 trillion US dollars worth of damage. All the security breaches and hacks and everything else that we deal with on a daily basis at this point. That's how large the scale of data privacy and security problems are to this day. The reason why the vast majority, if not all of these problems exist, is because in today's world, to use data means to move data. Literally, that's how the internet works. For me to use data, I need to transfer data from one server to another, to verify information about somebody, to have an application be able to read your preferences. It's all about data movement. So over the course of the last 30 years, when we're talking about data privacy and security, it's about the encryption of data at rest state. And then how do we send encrypted data from one place to another without the packets being intercepted? And how do we move private and public keys around so that the data can be decrypted and used? And all this time, somehow protecting the privacy of the individual, even though it means every single day somebody new now owns our data. Did you know that in developed countries like the United States, on average, all internet users have their identity data owned by, on average, 300 different companies? And I guarantee, by the way, Sasha and Mello, sorry to tell you, your number and my number is probably multiples of that, right? Multiples. Over 1,000 companies probably own a near full set of our identity data at this point. And we've lost all control of who we are, how that data is monetized and used, and our privacy, right? And it's because data needs to move. So our boring infrastructure at Terminal 3, the giant paradigm shift is this. Data should be accessible without transfer. So we have invested at the intersection of decentralized networks and advanced cryptography to build an infrastructure that allows a platform that allows data to remain secure in home storage in just a single database, and for it to be connected, verified, and then processed anywhere in the world without ever having to move. We do this primarily through cryptographic proofs, where data is a proof of something to do with the data, and a calculation of the data is issued and then can be verified and therefore accepted by any application without the data itself ever changing hands. We also do it with not a new technology called trusted execution environments, TEEs. These are cryptographic black boxes where you can send information to a black box, and then the black box can compute and then spit out an answer. But no one ever sees the information that goes in, and no one ever sees the calculation that happens. You can only read the actual query output. So you can get the answer to your question without ever seeing the underlying information. Of course, as part of our advanced cryptography, we use a lot of zero knowledge. We use homomorphic encryption for rest state encryption. There's threshold encryption, a bunch of other things. That Mayer coming together allows us to connect, verify, and process data while it remains in secure storage and still be able to have it used by applications around the world. So that's who we are. Now, that's a platform. The platform itself is really interesting hard tech, but it only becomes useful when there are applications. And so the primary applications that are now built on top of Terminal 3 are identity applications first. Makes a lot of sense, right? All this data we're talking about, our data, right? We can now securely store it in one place, and then we can allow applications and services to have access to it without actually ever holding a copy of it. So we now work with governments around Asia to issue cryptographic credentials against national ID systems so that we can check into a hotel in a foreign country without presenting our passport. Right? What a basic concept. Isn't it ridiculous that whenever we go around the world, every hotel we go to, we give them our passport, they take a photocopy of it, then they put it in an unlocked cabinet right behind them, and who knows what happens to that information, right? And we have with the amount, Sasha, that you travel, how many hotels in the world have a copy of your passport, right? It's crazy that in 2026,
so many.
that is still what we do. We shouldn't have to do that. So now using cryptographic proofs, we can actually allow somebody to check in without ever handing over a passport, right? This is just a basic example of what the applications are for identity. Sorry, Sasha, go ahead.
No, I think that's incredible. And Mello and I are huge advocates for digital identity infrastructure for so many reasons, I think, that we want to get into after kind of covering, what you guys are doing with Terminal 3. I think we've all been waiting for something like this because there are so many problems that you can realistically assign dollar values to. And what you guys are building, like you said, is rooted in hard tech, which is incredible. But for a lot of people, they don't understand how ZK proofs might work. They maybe don't even understand how blockchain works. And so that might not be so sexy for them. But from your perspective and from your own experience in what you guys are accomplishing with Terminal 3, there seems to be already several DID applications that are being used in countries within Europe and Asia and Africa. But what does that kind of future look like for expanding Terminal 3 infrastructure usage with different government entities, with companies, with organizations? And what does that kind of end goal look like for you? Like what is a normal person's life going to look like in 10 years, hopefully?
So this actually is a great segue into the Genesis story. It wasn't because of the South China Morning Post that I started Terminal 3. It wasn't just because of the South China Morning Post. Obviously, my time there introduced me to blockchain technologies, which are fundamental to our platform. And so it played a big role. But it actually was the entirety of my technology career. And so if there is a central thread, it's this. It's the fact that all of it led me to Terminal 3. Throughout all of it, through Google, AOL, Spotify, Digg, SCMP, I was working with user data, right? These are all digital content companies, distribution platforms. And for us to do our jobs properly, to create the products, to monetize the products, I was freely using customer information. And in fact, I was taught my entire career to accumulate as much of it as possible, to hoard it, and then to monetize it. But it's actually the correct M word is not monetization. It's actually to manipulate it. And so I've known for a very, very long time that this is what my career has been about. And when I saw decentralized technologies and then got to understand advanced cryptography, the kinds that we use now, including zero knowledge, I desperately wanted to atone for my sins, maybe in some ways, but to build solutions that allows my children to grow up in a much more secure world. But the question was, how? What did the user experience have to be? And so, Sasha, back to the point that you made. The reason why we've given away our data to 300 companies on average, willingly and happily, is because the user experience of the modern internet is magic. It is simple, right? What we now, in the Web3 world, people refer to as Web2 UX. I don't like it when people call it Web2 UX because it almost seems to like absolve Web3 engineers and builders from actually having to build good user experience, which is part of the reason why, this is an unpopular opinion, why Web3 moves so slowly, right? This is a whole nother podcast that we could do together because, at this point, Web3 is, or at least the blockchain technology is 17, 18 years old. What was the internet like after 17, 18 years? I'll tell you, it had moved and advanced far faster than blockchain and Web3 has. It's a very unpopular opinion, but I will stick to that. And part of the reason is because we don't care enough about the magic of user experience, right? And so for me, I came to understand that for data privacy and security to matter, it had to be as easy as all of the services that we've grown up using that has made us be willing to give away our data privacy and security. That's why Terminal 3 is an infrastructure company. We knew that by ourselves, we could not build that user experience. And in fact, a single company building that user experience does not change the world. But we know that there are many other companies out there, traditional industry companies, Web 1, Web 2 companies, that have phenomenal user experience. And they just need to be convinced that the way that they handle, the way that they store, the way that they treat user data needs to change. And thankfully for us, we entered into this world in 2022 around the same time that data privacy laws started getting really, really stringent because people started copying GDPR in Europe, that fines started growing exponentially. So actually companies were getting financially hurt by not handling data properly. And there was also at that point a massive escalation of data privacy hacks and breaches. And then shortly after that, we didn't know in 2022. We started a company, we incorporated a company a month before ChatGPT came out for the first time. We did not know about this AI agent future that was coming, okay? But now that it is here, those vulnerabilities just like have exploded, right? Or the acuteness of those vulnerabilities. So now we live in a world where many companies are concerned about it, but they have the user base and they have the user experience. They've made things easy. Now I just need to change their back end. That's why we're infrastructure companies. So that was a very long way of answering your very, very good question, which is our growth is in partnership with the world's banks, with the world's governments, with the world's largest internet platforms, with the payment structures or the payment systems that we already use today, hopefully like, whether it's Visa, Mastercard, Stripe, all those guys. So everything that you use today, my hope is that when Terminal 3 is successful, you will never, ever hear about our company name. You won't know who we are because it's all the companies that you already use and trust today taking greater responsibility with your data and providing greater trust to the rest of the world.
Wow, yeah, the agentic AI fell in your lap at the perfect time, actually. Yeah, it's really nice stroke of luck.
It feels like a hand grenade falling into our laps, though, Mello. So
yeah, it's good and bad.
I'm not comfortable with it right now.
No, but there's obviously a dire need for this. Like Sasha and I, we obsess over this, especially decentralized identity and the implications for AI as well. It's not just about vetting people; it's about vetting AI agents now as well. But before we get to that, we just wanted to talk like how practical is it and how in demand is it actually to have decentralized ID? Because a lot of people don't care that their company, 300 companies own their data. They just want that convenience. They want to be targeted by the right ads on Amazon or whatever. But do you think this is actually practical? Do you think enough people care about it right now? Like, I think in the future, they won't even know, like you said, but do enough people care right now? And, how do we verify people? Like you said, going back all the way to the beginning, you're sort of becoming the gatekeeper again, the reputational gatekeeper to make sure that the right people are trusted. And then obviously this changes how people operate online because they hide behind this anonymity as well. People act differently when they know that their actions can come back to haunt them, basically.
Let's also break that down into two parts. Let's take the last thing you said first, which is this idea of online anonymity. Okay, we'll take online anonymity first, and then whether or not the world actually knows that they need decentralized IDs. Okay. So anonymity is a really interesting topic, especially in the blockchain and Web3 world, right? Because there is a philosophy, an expectation of anonymity on blockchain. Why do we have an expectation of anonymity on blockchain? The reason is because blockchain is inherently transparent. Everything that happens on blockchain is available for all to see. And because of that, if your identity is attached to a single transaction or a single wallet, then everything you ever do is forever known. And that's a problem, which is why there's this expectation of anonymity. But here's the reality. The truth is that this complete transparency of blockchain is a bug. It's not a feature. The early builders and designers of blockchain, including the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin, have all said that this absolute transparency of blockchain will inevitably eventually be quote unquote fixed. Okay. So it is a bug. It's not a feature. We've come to accept it as a feature, and we now preach the advantages of a fully transparent distributed ledger. But the advantages of decentralization and universal access to a ledger does not necessarily mean it has to be fully transparent. That the state of that full transparency has led to us believing that anonymity is absolutely necessary online. The issue is anonymity is not practical. It will never be the position of a government, of regulators, of police enforcement that anonymity is acceptable. And unless you believe we're going to move into a truly Peter Thiel, anarchy state of being with no social contracts ever again, or like statehood, then anonymity is just not reality it's not realistic. Okay, the state of anonymity. So what we actually need is privacy preserving verifiability. That's what we need online. We need to be able to choose what we share about ourselves in a way that can be 100% verifiable, so that we can be accountable to our own actions without giving away who we are at all times. So anonymity is not the goal. Privacy preserving verifiability, I believe, should be the goal, and we have the technology for that. Okay, so that was your first part of your question. The second part is DIDs. Okay, where we've gone wrong with the rollout of decentralized IDs, which we've kind of established in our conversation, clearly a great idea, right? Why has it not scaled? Why are not enough users issuing their own DIDs? Why are not enough companies adopting DIDs? It's because our storytelling around DIDs has been wrong. Okay, the way we talk about decentralized IDs, we start with this idea of self-sovereignty, which again, philosophically makes sense. But when we talk about self-sovereignty and DIDs, it is all of your data and your identity fully owned by the user. That immediately creates a bunch of problems. One, for the user, it creates inconvenience. Because if DIDs are really like that, if I lose my phone that has my identity credential on it, I'm screwed. There is no recovery for it, right? I've lost access to everything. I have to reapply and reissue and prove myself again. It's extremely inconvenient. I don't want that inconvenience. I don't want that pressure. When you're talking about an enterprise and you try to sell them on decentralized IDs, the first thing they think is, wait a second, I no longer can access freely the data of my customers. That's a complete no-go. They will shut you down there. It doesn't matter how much you preach privacy to them. They don't care, because that's their business that you are cannibalizing. So what is actually the truth about decentralized IDs? Let's go back to our passports and our driver's licenses. Those things are actually decentralized IDs. How are they decentralized IDs? You hold them in your hand, you own them. No one can take the actual physical ID away from you. You present it however you want. Storekeepers, business owners, bar bouncers, they will accept it however they want. But when they need to verify whether or not this ID is legitimate, there is a central source of truth for them to tap to. That's the way decentralized IDs actually should work. So at the end of the day, decentralized IDs at scale are going to look like this. The actual verified identity information is going to be stored securely, hopefully decentrally, but sometimes it's still going to be centralized, like government ID systems. And there is going to be a root of trust, okay, that controls that source of data. But then you then get to effectively print your own ID cards, each one of which tells a selective amount about you. Here's my ID card that shows my verifiable age without showing you my birth date. Here's an ID card that shows that I'm a resident of Hong Kong without showing you my address. Here's an ID card that shows you that I'm an accredited investor, a professional investor, without showing you my account balance. You print as many IDs as you want, and you carry them with you, and you present them as you want to any company. They can verify and accept it as they please. But the underlying data itself remains secure. And somebody else might still technically have control of it, like a government, but the actual use of your identity claims is truly self-sovereign and decentralized. And in that situation, I can actually now control how people monetize my identity claims, how advertisers actually target me with advertising. Because you know what? I'm going to give you these 5 ID cards, and you're allowed to use these 5, one of which says I love to run, right, to target me with ads. And then I get paid for you having access to this card that says that I love to run so that Nike and Adidas and Puma can send me their shoe ads. I personally think that that's the way that decentralized IDs are going to look. It's going to look like what we have today in digital form. And I think that if we're able to get over this idea of like, at some point our data is still probably going to remain in some kind of controlled and regulated storage, right? And governments and enforcement agencies and regulators are still going to know who we are. If we can get past that reality is just going to always exist, then we will be able to actually create DID solutions like the ones that Terminal 3 are issuing right now that can change the world for the better and make us safer.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing these trends slowly on the consumer front. I think people are becoming more accustomed to these identities or these ideas of identities living on digital networks that remove some frictions and create some accountability and greater transparency. I want to ask you on, let's say, the B2B front here, the enterprise front, and going back to a quote from December of last year, Adam Mosseri, who is the CEO of Instagram, famously stated in an interview that the feed is dead, and referencing the dead internet theory and how Gen AI has really accelerated this amount of AI slop that's being presented on platforms that largely caters to people that are just essentially milking dopamine centers of their brain. And I'm curious because in the case of a big company like Instagram and even a startup, there is some financial incentive to continue this cycle of posting content that is just simply getting engagement, but also doing anything you can to boost user numbers, whether it's on, seeking advertisement revenue from potential clients or sponsors, or raising that next fundraising round as a startup. Do you think there's any incentive for some of these consumer-focused ecosystems to adopt this sort of technology, considering that it may hurt their numbers on engagement or users or anything else, specifically around the Gen AI usage there?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really hard, and that's actually why I think regulation around AI content is going to have to come hard and fast for these platforms to change their behavior. We've already brought up internet economics. Another thing that you just brought up that is driving a lot of this bad behavior and has been for 20 some years is venture capital. Like literally the way that venture capital works, it incentivizes startups and platforms to push for vanity numbers because then you can go raise at a higher valuation, and you can continue to be unprofitable for many, many years and extract total value out of the industry as a founder and as investors. Doesn't really matter, if you're creating actual real value for the industry or if you're hurting it. So I hate to say it, I'm not a heavily pro-regulation guy. I really am not. But I have seen the extent of these issues with AI, right? And AI slop is the tip of the iceberg. I honestly think that in another year or two, we're not going to be talking about AI slop because we're going to be confronted with the very, very large and very real problems of generative AI and AI agents. It's going to make AI slop not disappear as a problem, but seem so minor in context, right? We're talking about a world in which we expect in the next 4 to 5 years, we will get to 1 billion AI agents that are making 10 billion transactions on a daily basis. The total amount of actual dollars changing hands between fully autonomous agents by 2030 is right now projected at $5 trillion US, right? And when something goes wrong with AI agents, it is going to be at a scale that we cannot imagine today. AI agents today are already so good at faking who they are and what authority that they have, right? And they're only going to get better. And because they operate with probabilistic behavior and not the deterministic behavior that we've built all of our fraud detecting solutions across the internet around for the last 20 years, AI agents can get around literally every lattice and every circuit breaker that we have put up to fend off bad behavior on the internet. And so by the time, and by the way, they don't log anything. There is no audit trail for any of their actions. So we can't even, when we find something wrong, we can't even figure out when it went wrong, right? And who is responsible for it today. So the first major breakage that happens with agentic commerce or A to A payments is likely going to be at a volume, at a quantum that destroys a company, potentially wrecks a domestic economy, right? Those are problems that are really, really fundamental. Right? Not to mention the fact that if we do not start to protect our sovereign identities, like literally as sentient human beings, AI can become us in a much more compelling way than we are ourselves. And suddenly we lose control not only of our finances, but of our reputation, our credibility, our network, our friendships, everything, right? I am not trying to scare people within the concept of Skynet because it's much more practical than Skynet and like robots launching nukes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very present reality that all of our internet infrastructure and systems are built in a way to fend off bad actors that are human. And we're very good at catching that now. But there's an entire race of potential bad actors that, by the way, have no ethics. They don't see it as a morality issue. Agents do not see it. They see it as an efficiency and productivity issue. They're trying to accomplish a goal. They'll do whatever is necessary to accomplish the goal. That is their mission, right? And so, and we're not ready for it, right? So, going back to Adam Mosseri's quote, I don't think the feed is dead, but I do think that, I do think that the value of a feed is going to be rooted in how much we can trust it, and trust right now is a super loose concept.
I'm curious, lingering on that topic of AI agents, this is the general evolution of what we're seeing as far as consumer-focused retail applications. I think when people were talking about agents early on, I think they were referencing, let's say, some autonomous infrastructure that can reorder your toilet paper on Amazon, or go day trade on some cryptocurrency exchange, or Fidelity even, or create some content on your Instagram feed. But a lot of this infrastructure is largely centralized. And I think that there are a lot of agents that people have deployed already that do many of these things across many different platforms and ecosystems that don't really want to have to be forced to register its identity to them as an individual, or have to comply with some mandate on a platform itself. And so what do you kind of see happening in the future, as far as we know that agentic use cases are going to balloon? We know that this is going to be a massive economy and there's going to be a lot of money behind it. But in your perspective, what do you see that looking like as far as the trajectory we're going on now, and what do you want that to look like?
Yeah, there are actually multiple different directions that this is moving. I'm not sure what wins. We've made a bet on what wins. I'll explain that in a minute. But the easiest way to describe the multiple different layers of it is if we take a look at early attempts at regulation in the European Union and also in California as well, you start seeing that regulation have separated these layers of the stack to think about whether or not they should regulate the foundational models, or they should regulate the applications, or they should regulate the transaction platforms, or should they regulate the human operators? So what part of this stack are we layering accountability or the expectations of accountability onto? Okay? There is no answer. Actually, none of the regulators have figured out who they should be regulating yet. Okay, we have made the bet that the accountability is going to be likely at the application and the transaction level. Okay? And so we're saying that foundational models, maybe there's going to be regulation around foundational models, but I think a lot of regulators, especially those in the United States, are going to say, if we regulate foundational models, we're going to slow innovation, and we don't want to do that. When it comes to regulating the human layer, they're going to say regulation already exists. Right, financial regulators are already going to be like professional investors, fund managers. They all have to be licensed. So that regulation already covers anything they do, regardless of what tool set they're using. So if they're using AI agents to algorithmically trade right now, the existing regulation already covers their accountability. And so the new regulations that we're likely going to see is going to be at the application and the transaction layers, okay? So we're making a bit of a bet on that. And so what we realized is that, okay, if we look at these two layers, there are 4 fundamental issues with that are keeping us from true agentic scale. The first is systems do not know if they're speaking to the correct agent, because agents are really, really good at faking who they are. The second fundamental issue is that systems do not know whether or not an agent actually has the authority to perform a transaction that they're saying that they're going to perform, because they're also very, very good at faking their credentials and permissions. The third fundamental issue is data privacy, because what we're doing today for agents is that we're literally handing them really, really, really sacred and private information directly into agent memory. And as we now know, every time data touches agent memory, we've lost control of it fully. And agents have already shown that without bounds, they are going to immediately trade that information to reach their goals. Okay. And then the fourth fundamental problem, which I already mentioned, is that if something goes wrong, we have no logs and no reliable audit trail to figure out what went wrong or to cut the cord and have a circuit breaker. So Terminal 3 has taken everything that we've learned and built for sentient human identity over the course of the last 4 years, and we are repackaging and redeploying it for an agentic commerce future, a future of billions of AI agents. We're issuing verifiable identities for AI agents, so systems always know that they're speaking to the exact correct agent. We're using our smart cryptographic credentials as programmable permissions, so that agents can have verifiable authority that they can even delegate to sub-agents that all systems can rely on. 3, we're using our decentralized trusted execution environment network to vault and secure private information and provide AI agents only querying access so they can use the data, but they never get it in their memory. And then 4, we are creating immutable audit trails for all agent transactions on chain so that people can go back and look at what went wrong, or we can build circuit breakers programmatically on them. And the reason we can do that is because we abstract identity now using cryptographic credentials. So these fundamental problems at the application and transaction layer that keep us from true agentic scale, Terminal 3, we believe we've started to solve for. So our Agent Guard and Agent Auth platforms, Agent Guard being for people who are just experimenting with OpenClaw, and Agent Auth being a far more, it's a more comprehensive infrastructure layer for enterprises and governments. That both of those two platforms will launch in the coming weeks to help those that are deploying AI agents to do it securely and safely.
Well, I think that's going to be the biggest moneymaker in the future for you guys. I think this is more important than anything else that's going on. But we could talk endlessly about this, and we're definitely going to have you back on, because I think Sasha and I prepared hundreds of questions for you going down these rabbit holes. But I just want to bring it back full circle to the beginning, to your journey. And we have a lot of founders and builders and professionals in the industry, people that want to work in startup that watch this show. So, and you're an impressive guy. You've helmed major organizations. You've worked in tech for a long time. You've managed to raise $8 million for Terminal 3 from investors. Do you have any good advice for people that are watching this that might want to be like you, that want to start their own company, that want to break into tech or change careers maybe, or even get into journalism?
Oh, that's a hard one, Mello.
It's my favorite question to ask. I know it's a hard one.
I don't think I have good advice, but I will say this. I feel very fortunate that I never saw being a startup CEO or actually being a CEO as a goal. And I think that knowing myself and knowing the streaks of ego that handcuff me constantly and make me do stupid things and say stupid things, that had that been an actual goal in my head, I would have made so many mistakes and still not have, accomplished what I've been fortunate enough to accomplish, and certainly not have had the privilege of working with the great people that I've worked with over my career so far. I never had that as the goal. Becoming an entrepreneur was the was sort of a milestone in a journey. And the only reason I became an entrepreneur, because this stuff is like, I mean, I don't know if entrepreneurship is still seen as sexy, but the truth is that entrepreneurs that, I mean, like, again, back to social media, like, it looks like a lot of fun. It looks like a lot of freedom, but it's actually mostly just like gut-wrenching anxiety constantly, right? And dealing with fires on a daily basis. And doing things, by the way, that you're incredibly uncomfortable with and that you're absolutely not qualified to do because you've never done it before, and trying to make the best out of it. That's what entrepreneurship is. So for me, building this company, becoming an entrepreneur right now for this was a means to an end. And that end matters a lot more to me. Again, I have 2 kids. I have 2 sons. They're 5 and 3 years old. I want them to grow up in a world where enterprises treat them as individual human beings, not just as data points to be monetized. And therefore, they have more privacy and more security than I did growing up on the internet, right? I want that reality for them. I think that is a safer world. And so I felt like becoming an entrepreneur or building this myself was a necessary step to form that world. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Same with my time at Digg. I didn't join Digg because I wanted to be a CEO. I joined Digg because I loved the brand, and I really believed that I had something more of value to contribute to a messy content space at that point. And then you've already heard my story about the South China Morning Post. I joined that company because I believed in that the world needs to understand each other better. And so all of it, like becoming CEO, becoming an entrepreneur, they were all a means to an end. If you figured out that end and that end really matters to you and matters to the world, that's all you really need.
And see, that's incredibly great advice. Yeah, you're very qualified to give advice, I think. And, like to us, that's very obvious. I think we've been through that journey. You're right. Like, this idea of being an entrepreneur, and from my perspective, and speaking with everyone I know, they still think it's sexy. What they don't know is that I have a 15-hour straight workday today, and that's just the norm, right? But
this is the worst part of that 15 hours, Sasha. I'm sorry.
No, this is the best part. Let's be honest. But many people they have this strange pie in the sky goal, which is I have a dream of being a CEO or whatever. That's kind of a strange goal, honestly. Because you're saying, I just want to be held accountable and responsible for so many other people and so many other things. But I think that's fantastic advice. We've got to unfortunately end the podcast soon. We're going to end it with one more question, the same way we begin and end all of our Boom Room discussions here. And so I'm going to go ahead and give you that question. And there's only one rule. The answer to that question cannot be Terminal 3, your own company. But it's very simple. What in the next 6 to 12 months are you most bullish on right now? It could be a person, place, thing, meta, narrative, whatever.
I'm really bullish on how community is going to shape the evolution of AI in the next 12, 18, 24 months. What I mean by that is artificial intelligence up until this point has been shaped by a handful of very, very important, extraordinary researchers, and then very, very large, extremely well-funded companies that may not have our best interests in mind. But I think OpenClaw has shown us something completely different. The fact that now, just in the last week, 2 weeks, we have news coming out of these first version OpenClaw meetups in New York City, in San Francisco, in Singapore, that have attracted thousands of builders. In mainland China, by the way, there are these lines going around the blocks in China scale of thousands and thousands of people waiting to have OpenClaw installed on their private computing devices so that they can play with it. And this community has come together to reinvent what generative AI is supposed to be able to do for us. That was always the promise, is that we become bionic, and therefore we become better human beings because we release our time for a higher level greater horizon tasks, right? Or to be better fathers and better mothers and better friends and children, whatever it is, right? And we're seeing community finally coalesce around these technologies to do so. And then while doing that, inventing the privacy and security solutions that need to come along with this technology, not for money, but because we all as a community require it. So I'm really bullish on what the community will create and how it will drive change in large, nearly $1 trillion businesses that may not have our best interests at heart, but have to listen to people because, the voice of community is still that powerful.
It's another great answer. Open source everything too. I think that's the importance of open source technology that people can actually play around with. So yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, Gary, we've got to close it out. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on here talking about what you're doing with Terminal 3, all of the things that you've done that have led to this point and the journey forward. I want to remind all of our audience members, if you're interested in learning more about Gary and Terminal 3, we're going to drop some of the links in the show notes below, so check below. And if you're enjoying this content, as always, make sure you tap or smack or hit that like button and follow us to view some other great content. We've got some fun boom rooms coming out in the future and more weekly recaps. Gary, thank you so much for coming on, man. And really hoping to speak to you again more soon.
Let's do it again. This was such a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary.
All right. Take care, everybody. Ciao.